The British Empire didn't build its wealth on trade. It built it on the largest drug trafficking operation in human history. Here's the setup, my friend. It's the late 1700s, and Britain has a massive problem. The British people are absolutely obsessed with Chinese tea. I mean, we're talking a full-blown national addiction. Tea had gone from a luxury item to the thing that literally fueled the entire British working class. Every morning, every afternoon, every factory break, tea. Without it, the factories don't run, morale collapses, and the empire doesn't function. Simple as that. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to know how trade worked back then. Britain was on the gold standard, which meant every purchase had to be backed by actual silver or gold. There was no printing money, no credit cards, no financial tricks. If you wanted Chinese tea, you paid in cold, hard silver, and Britain was hemorrhaging it. But here's the thing, buddy. China didn't want anything Britain was selling. Not their wool, not their clocks, not their fancy manufactured goods. The Chinese emperor basically looked at British traders and said, "We have everything we need. Thanks, but no thanks." And he wasn't wrong. China at that point had the world's largest economy. They produced silk, porcelain, and tea that the entire world craved. What could Britain possibly offer that China didn't already have? So Britain had a catastrophic trade deficit. Mountains of silver were flowing out of British vaults and into China, just to keep the tea coming. The Bank of England was getting nervous. Politicians were panicking. And if you know anything about empires, you know they don't lose money quietly. They find a way to flip the script, no matter who gets hurt. Enter the East India Company. Now, these weren't just merchants, my friend. This was a corporation with its own private army. We're talking over 250,000 soldiers at its peak, more than most European nations had. It had its own navy, its own legal system, and a license from the British Crown to do basically whatever it took to turn a profit. Think of them as the world's first mega-corporation, except with cannons and the full backing of the most powerful government on earth. The company had massive opium poppy fields in Bengal, India, territory they controlled through brutal colonial exploitation. Indian farmers were forced to grow poppies instead of food crops. Let that sink in for a moment. People who needed to grow rice to feed their families were instead growing the raw material for narcotics, because a corporation on the other side of the world needed to balance its books. If farmers refused, they were beaten, fined, or thrown off their land. It was drug farming at gunpoint, and no one in London batted an eye. And here's where it gets really dark. The East India Company started smuggling opium into China on an industrial scale. They knew it was illegal in China. The emperor had banned it. They didn't care. They set up a network of corrupt Chinese middlemen, bribed local officials, and used fast clipper ships to outrun any patrol boats. We're not talking about small-time dealers on street corners. This was a state-sponsored, corporate-backed, drug trafficking operation, the likes of which the world had never seen. The opium flooded into Chinese port cities first, then spread inland like a plague. By the 1830s, there were an estimated 12 million opium addicts in China. 12 million! Entire communities were being destroyed. Workers couldn't work. Soldiers couldn't fight. Government officials were smoking in their offices. Families were torn apart as fathers sold everything, furniture, land, even their children, to feed the addiction. The silver that had been flowing into China was now flooding back out. The trade deficit had completely reversed exactly as the British had planned. The Chinese government wasn't blind to what was happening. Emperor Dao Guang appointed a fierce official named Lin Zexu to stamp out the opium trade. Lin didn't mess around. He wrote a letter directly to Queen Victoria, a remarkable document, asking her how she would feel if Chinese merchants flooded Britain with poison. He appealed to her sense of morality, her duty as a Christian monarch. The letter was never answered. It probably never even reached her desk. Then Lin went to Canton, blockaded the foreign traders in their warehouses, and confiscated over 20,000 chests of opium. That's roughly 1,400 tons of pure narcotics, and destroyed every last grain of it. He mixed it with lime and salt and flushed it into the sea. It took 23 days, and this, my friend, is where the mask comes completely off. Did Britain apologize? Did they acknowledge that they'd been running the largest drug operation in human history? Of course not. Instead, they declared war. The official reason: protection of free trade. Let me say that again so it really lands. Britain went to war to protect its right to sell drugs to a nation that was begging them to stop. The first Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842, and it wasn't even close. British warships, steam-powered ironclads armed with the latest artillery, absolutely devastated China's wooden junks and medieval fortifications. The technological gap was enormous, and the carnage was one-sided. Chinese soldiers fought bravely with matchlock muskets and swords, weapons that were centuries behind what the British brought. The British had Congreve rockets, explosive shells, and the HMS Nemesis, an iron steamship that could navigate shallow rivers and destroy anything in its path. It was a massacre dressed up as a war. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, one of the most humiliating documents in Chinese history. China was forced to open 5 ports to British trade. They had to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations, essentially paying Britain for the privilege of being invaded. And oh yeah, they had to hand over Hong Kong. Just like that. An entire territory. Gone, because China had the audacity to try and stop drug dealers from destroying their population. But here's what really gets me, buddy. The treaty didn't even mention opium. The British made sure of that. They dressed the whole thing up as a dispute about trade rights and diplomatic protocol. The drug trafficking? That just quietly continued. In fact, it accelerated massively. And it only got worse. By the 1850s, the opium trade was bigger than ever, and Britain wanted even more concessions. When a flimsy excuse presented itself, a minor incident involving a ship called the Arrow, where Chinese officials boarded a vessel that may or may not have been flying a British flag, Britain launched the Second Opium War, this time dragging France along for the ride. In 1860, British and French troops marched into Beijing and burned the Summer Palace to the ground. This was one of the most magnificent architectural complexes in the world. Hundreds of buildings, priceless artworks, jade sculptures, ancient manuscripts, gardens that had taken over a century to create. All reduced to ashes in a fire that burned for 3 days. Soldiers stuffed their pockets with stolen treasures. It was a deliberate act of cultural terrorism designed to humiliate the Chinese emperor into total submission. Lord Elgin, who ordered the destruction, called it a necessary punishment. History calls it a crime. The resulting treaties forced China to legalize opium, open even more ports, allow Christian missionaries throughout the country, and pay massive new reparations. The Chinese call this period the Century of Humiliation, and honestly, that name barely scratches the surface. Now here's the part that should make your blood boil. While all of this was happening back in Britain, there was a growing moral panic about domestic alcohol consumption. That's right. The same government that was forcing opium on millions of Chinese people was simultaneously launching temperance campaigns at home, worried about the moral decay caused by gin. British politicians gave passionate speeches about protecting citizens from the evils of drink, while their treasury overflowed with drug money from the other side of the world. The hypocrisy is staggering, but it makes perfect sense when you understand what this was really about. It was never about morality. It was never about free trade. It was about one thing: money, the flow of capital, the balance sheet of empire, The East India Company and its successors made astronomical profits from opium. The British government collected enormous tax revenues. The entire financial architecture of the British Empire in Asia was built on narcotics trafficking. By the 1880s, opium revenue accounted for roughly 15% of British India's total income. That's not a side hustle. That's a pillar of imperial finance. And the human cost? Conservative estimates suggest that by the end of the 19th century, up to 40 million Chinese people were regular opium users. Entire generations were lost. The economic devastation set China back decades and created the conditions for the famines, civil wars, and revolutions that would follow. So the next time someone tells you the British Empire was about spreading civilization, about building railways and establishing the rule of law, remember this, my friend. Remember that the single most profitable enterprise of the world's largest empire was getting an entire nation hooked on drugs, and then going to war twice when they tried to say no. That's not a footnote in history. That's the whole story. And the fact that it's still not taught properly in most schools tells you everything you need to know about who writes the history books. Thanks for sticking with me through this one, buddy. If this changed how you see the world even a little bit, smash that subscribe button. Because this is exactly the kind of history they don't want you to know.